Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
This is RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Welcome aboard. The latest round of indirect talks between the U.S. and Iran over its nuclear program started last week in Vienna. RANE's senior global analyst, Matthew Bay, is here with details. Hi, Matthew.
Hey, Emily.
Can you tell me what progress, if any, has been made in the talks over the last week?
Yeah, so Joseph Borrell, he's the head of the EU's Foreign Affairs Department. He came out on the 8th and said that final text had been reached, and it was now basically decision time for governments to decide whether or not they want to accept the text that has been negotiated. He basically said that everything that could be done through negotiations has been done. He seems to be thinking that the Iranians and the Americans really can't negotiate any further. Anything that hasn't been already put into the draft text to re-enter the JCPOA is probably something that can't be really bridged, or in the sense of maybe Iran is pushing for things that the West is not willing to accept. For example, something around, probes into Iran's nuclear program by the IAEA. So that's the kind of the status. Is basically there's text now. All of the different government heads and negotiators are going back to their own countries and deciding whether or not they need to make a decision on whether or not to move forward with the process.
This doesn't sound very hopeful. So what is the main holdup from Iran?
Yeah, so the main holdup, and I kind of mentioned this a bit, is that Iran is demanding the end of a IAEA probe into previous Iranian nuclear activity and material that was found at 3 undeclared nuclear sites. It's a probe that the IAEA has been going on for several years now. But the point is that Iran is basically tying negotiations concluding to the IAEA probe being ended, whereas the U.S. and the West is basically saying that that's a separate issue. The probe was never, or Iran's status of that kind of stuff was never really something that was a part of the original JCPOA, so it's basically out of scope. It's a non-starter essentially for the West, and that's kind of where we're at now, where Iran has made this demand, and the U.S. and the EU are saying, well, that's not something that we can do. It's a non-starter for us. So that's the thing. That's kind of where we're at when we have like Iran trying to essentially find what may be an excuse, to be honest, to continue stringing along dialogue. The reason I say it may be an excuse is that we've had now pretty much every time that we've come close to an agreement, Iran has pointed to some new demand, whatever that new demand is, can change from time to time, and saying that it will not, reach an agreement until the West comes back accepting that demand. A few months ago, we were talking about how Iran's was demanding the U.S. remove the IRGC, so that's Iran's elite military, from its foreign terrorist organization list. That is something that Iran's not speaking. That's something the West or the U.S. said no. So it appears that Iran is now finding another excuse to not sign the deal. And if you think about it, Iran, it's probably realizing that it doesn't necessarily need to sign a deal. Politically at home, the government's relatively strong. Yes, there are protests, but there's not really a threat to the government. Yes, the economy is in shambles, but the Iranian establishment has learned that they can survive politically even if the economy is being heavily sanctioned. So if Iran has made that assessment, then it might be that Iran is holding out for some very big, showy concession from the West, whether it be something on the IRGC designation, something around the safeguard probe, to a host of issues that, in order for them to actually be demanding, or agreeing, to sign the agreement. So they seem to be just making all these demands of string-along diplomacy, and at some point they're going to, I guess, hope for the West to make significant concessions or something that they can hold up as being a success. That's kind of what they might be wanting to get as a way to sign the deal.
So are there any holdups on the Western side, the U.S. side?
So no, there aren't really holdups on the West. They've more or less agreed to the text, it seems, although it looks like the State Department here in the United States is still looking over the final draft, despite it being, quote, final text from the EU's perspective. But the U.S. and the West, they have made their positions clear. They want a narrow re-entry to the old JCPOA. Everything else that Iran has been putting on top of that is something that they're not willing to discuss, and they really haven't been willing to discuss significantly since the beginning. So they're still taking that approach, it seems.
So let me ask you one last question then. If Iran does not approve this text, what comes next?
If Iran doesn't approve the text, then there's a couple of options that the West would have. So one is the West can try to essentially trigger the more formal exit from the JCPOA. The dispute mechanism within, the formal snapback of the sanctions mechanism within the JCPOA was never triggered. Remember, the U.S. Exited the deal and then just put sanctions on Iran. They could formally trigger that response, which would then mean that UN sanctions would presumably snap back on Iran. It would require the EU probably triggering it. So that's one kind of sanctions diplomatic aspect. The second, though, we have to consider as more of a worst case scenario is if the West doesn't want to continue going down the path of endless talks. Well, do they need to escalate in essentially non-diplomatic means as well? And in the sense I mean by that is like covert activity against Iran's nuclear program, which is something that is becoming much more significant and much more advanced with every passing day. Obviously, Israel, not a party to the talks, of course, but it is a country that is really concerned about Iran's nuclear development and has probably, dusted off more daring mission and operations that they could launch in the future with or without U.S. support.
Matthew Bay is RANE's senior global analyst. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Emily.
You can read Matthew's work in Worldview, RANE's geopolitical intelligence solution. Worldview is a professional application focused on analysis, not just a publication with news. Sign up for a trial at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. And I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.